Hey everybody, welcome to week 2 of popular culture. Let's get talking about one of my favorite theorists, Michel Foucault. So first off, I just want to say that I understand this is difficult. Like the reading, the excerpt is not one that you're probably going to completely understand fully, and I will let you in on a little secret. Most people with PhDs in this field don't really 100% understand this. I don't think there is such a thing as 100% understanding Michel Foucault. So then why am I putting you through this? Why do this? Well, because I think you will learn a lot just simply trying to understand and thinking through some of these ideas. But I know it's not simple, and I know that this may look very different than maybe you have another class or you're used to classes where you kind of get these bits of information, then your professor, your teacher asks you later, like, what was bit 1, what was bit 2, and then you just regurgitate and fill in a form or do whatever. Definitely not how this class will work, and so to some people that's going to be quite new. This is my advice. Every week, pretty much, we're going to be reading an excerpt from the book, the John Story edited collection, and this excerpt, in this case, is Michel Foucault. It's titled Method, and it's from a larger book called The History of Sexuality. If you're ever not sure about something, I encourage you to look it up, because looking up a bit about Michel Foucault and his work would help you better understand things. But what I would suggest is, in addition to looking up whatever extra stuff you have or you want to find out, start by asking yourself a few simple questions. And if you've had me in a class before, you've heard me say this. I would start by asking, what do I think is important? What do I think is difficult? And more importantly, why do I think it's difficult? So sometimes people might read a passage, say, I don't get it. And that is a useless statement, and I hate when people say that to me, because it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help me explain it. It doesn't help you better understand it. So don't say something to yourself or to your professor like, I don't get it. Instead, try to phrase it like this if you can, because I promise it'll be a lot more helpful for you and for me. What is it that you don't understand, or what is it that seems so confusing? So for example, if Foucault keeps saying this phrase, power, knowledge, which we'll talk about in a moment, and you could say something like, I don't really get how these two phrases or how these two words go together to make this phrase, and whether or not it means what I think it means, which is, the dictionary definition of power, dictionary definition of knowledge. Those aren't the same thing, and yet he keeps saying it as if it's the same thing. I don't understand how these two terms connect. That we can work with, right? Because then I can try to explain it a little bit. You can try to better understand it by thinking about the question you're posing. So for starters, ask yourself if you're having trouble, and I guarantee you will have trouble with these readings, because I have trouble reading them now, and I had trouble reading them in grad school. So that's not to say you can't get anything from it. It's just we know it's going to be a challenge. So not just what don't you get, but what is it that seems difficult? Why is it difficult? And then we can work on that, right? So start maybe highlighting if you're reading in a book that you can highlight, or if you're online, you can highlight on the screen perhaps with a device. Ask yourself, what is it that seems important? So sometimes a phrase or a sentence won't really matter in the grand scheme of things, and you might be able to look past that. Sometimes it's clearly something that the author keeps referring to, and in which case you kind of need to understand that. So what seems more important? What seems less important? That's something to think about. Then what seems difficult, and why is it difficult? And then finally, one of the last things is, what sounds cool or what sounds beautiful? I tell people to look for those phrases, not because it's useless or something, but because when you're writing your essay or you're writing your analysis, you probably want to think about, Foucault had this brilliant phrase that I could never say myself, like I could never come up with it myself, and I think it's impactful because it made me think about XYZ. So that might be like a beautiful passage, or just like a really well-written phrase. You want to sort of collect those as we keep reading, because in a few weeks, you're going to do an essay, And then maybe you want to put that phrase in your essay, obviously quoting the author. So yeah, definitely look for something. I'm surprised people don't do this more often. It's something I started asking myself after I started really getting into scholarship. Definitely not my first or second year as an undergrad, but I definitely encourage you to think about, what is a beautiful passage from this, and then why is it beautiful, right? Like what makes it so appealing? Is it because it makes you envision something, or is it because it made you totally reconsider what you thought you already knew about, let's say, power or methods, whatever? So as you're reading, mark down with notes, maybe highlighting, whatever works for you. Maybe some people like to dictate and listen to their notes later or something when they're reviewing. But ask yourself, what seems most important? What seems most challenging, and why? Why do I not understand? Or what is it that I'm having trouble understanding? Not, I don't get it, but this in particular seems difficult. I wonder if it means this, or perhaps it means this. Because then once you have that, you might realize, oh, I do understand it better now. Or you can come to me, or whoever, maybe a classmate, and say, this is what I'm having trouble with. Much better than saying, I don't get it and giving up. That said, let me give you a little bit of history of Michel Foucault. As I said, he's one of my favorite scholars. He's one of the people he's impacted more scholars than anyone else, I think, in this field. And that's because he's written on a diverse range of topics. He's also, he was a brilliant person. And his main work, let's say, focused on these three things that seem kind of disparate, but they're also quite connected once you see the connections. So he started thinking about madness, like insanity, and how historically people have understood that. And from there, he started thinking about asylums, he started thinking about clinics, mental institutions, psychiatric institutions, right? So that was one of his main foci, or one of the main focuses. I'm not sure if it's foci or focuses. I should really look this up before I start going on about it. Maybe you can tell me. Bonus points to anyone who can explain whether it's foci or focuses. I've seen both. Anyway, that's a tangent. What he did afterwards was start to think about criminals. And maybe you'll start to see the connection, right? So he goes from asylums and mental institutions and psychiatry to policing, criminology, and the prison or the jail, places where criminals were put, and then also, of course, trials, like how criminals were tried and how they were found guilty or not guilty, and these kinds of things, right? And then finally, later on, where this excerpt is actually from, is his work on sexuality. And so that's somewhat different, but if you actually look back, sex in particular, outside of marriage, outside of heteronormative relationships, that was seen as both a representation of madness, like you were crazy if you were gay, or you were insane if you, kept having sex outside of what whatever religion was in power was saying you should be doing. So you were also criminalized, right? So there are connections between these groups, right? The insane, the criminal, and the sexual deviant. These are like the three sort of big groups that he looked at in his history. And he found a lot of interesting things. One of the things I want to think about with you is the way in which, as I said earlier, power and knowledge go together. That was one of his big contributions. So it might seem hard to understand at first, but it'll probably start to make a lot of sense too, right? So you might have heard, knowledge is power, or, power and knowledge go together. The more you know, the more powerful you can be. Great. All of that's sort of true. What he was interested in is the people in power are able to produce knowledge, which seems weird, right? Because knowledge of the truth, of facts, should be everywhere, and anyone should be able to do that, right? But it's only the people, and in particular the institutions, that are powerful that are able to say what is true. If you've been following politics in the last few years, you've probably noticed this, that whoever is in power, and there's been, at least in the US, a struggle over power, is also a struggle over knowledge. So different groups want you to believe different things. And if you look back in time, psychiatrists or psychologists wanted people, for whatever reasons, to follow what they said, right? And what they said, among other things, was how to diagnose mentally ill people. And so you get these incredible stories. Like, we look back on it now and we think, how could that ever have happened? it happened because the people doing it had power. But you might have heard phrases like hysteria, right? And if you've ever heard of a hysterectomy, those two things are talking about the same thing, basically a woman's uterus. So the idea was that the uterus was causing a woman to go crazy, and therefore she was hysterical. And the way to deal with that often involves sort of these weird sexual things, which seems absolutely insane until you start thinking about it. Well, one, it was only older men who were coming up with these things. Like, they never really consulted women as they came up with ideas of hysteria. They didn't understand bodies, anatomy like we do today. And so they were basically left to be like, okay, well, why are women crazy? I don't know, it's because of their uterus. And let's, I don't know, come up with a term for that. It's called hysteria. And then boom, you can point to someone and say, you're hysterical. But that could have gone a whole different way if, say, women were in charge and there were no men in charge. I doubt very much we'd have phrases like hysteria, right? It just wouldn't make sense. Instead, maybe we'd have something about how you have a crazy penis, and therefore that's the new disease, and you have that now because whatever, we said so. So that's a good case in point of how you can see, like, the psychiatrists who were in power, I'm talking 1800s and so on, could say stuff, and because they had the power, they would suddenly create a thing like a hysteria, which didn't exist before, and now it does. Criminology, same thing. A lot of people, especially in the US, have gone to jail for, say, smoking marijuana, right? For buying marijuana. Now, if you go to certain states, that's totally legal, and if you go to other places, it's totally illegal. So there's no truth to it. It's not like it's true that like marijuana is criminal or not criminal. It's only, like, inherently bad, I mean. It's only true that people in power, in this case legislators, police officers, things like that, have said that that's criminal or not, and so it becomes that. So you can see how people in power are able to say things, and then those things become true. Not true as in like a biological or a natural history sense, but instead true as in a social way, right? They become social facts, as some sociologists have put it. And then finally, sexuality, which is, again, what Foucault was primarily interested in and where he came up with a lot of great ideas about power. You used to be crazy if you were gay, now you're not. That's not because gay people suddenly went from being crazy to not being crazy. It's because the acceptance of those in power went from absolute condemnation, you were both criminal and possibly insane, to, no, you're just a normal person who, prefers different things than what we have originally prescribed. And so that totally changes, and yet nothing changed, right? Nothing objective changed, only the subjective people in power and what they were able to say changed. That's what Foucault is really interested in, especially how it works with institutions. So sometimes these changes happen, and they don't happen because anybody said, hey, I'm the king of this country or this kingdom. I'm now saying that this is a crime and this is not a crime and whatever, right? We kind of think of power like that, which is an old way of thinking of it. So yes, a king could say something like, I now pronounce that this is a new crime and people will be put to death for that. And then so throughout the kingdom, that becomes a crime. And oftentimes the king would say, like, this is God's decree, or this is the way it always is and always will be, which, it's usually not. Usually it's just somebody saying that. So that's the traditional idea of power. What happens now, Foucault says, is that all of these little bits of networks, right? So people, psychiatry, criminologists and police and judges and lawyers, and you can take a bunch of different places and a bunch of different people within those places, and even if they don't agree, there's this general idea that as a group, they're pushing things in certain directions. And so he looks at Victorian England in particular and says that, people kept saying that they're not able to express themselves sexually or talk about sex, but actually these professionals, these psychiatrists, were always talking about sex. They just said it in a professional way as doctors, right? As opposed to people. So if you were a quote unquote average Joe, you weren't allowed to talk about sex. That was, bad, that was forbidden. But if you were a doctor, you could talk about sex all day long. You just had to couch it in these special terms that you used, right? And so this is actually how power works. It circulates through the way that we talk about things and what we say you're allowed to talk about and not allowed to talk about. I know this probably seems like a lot, but I want you to just think about how power and knowledge fit together, because that's going to be a theme throughout the course and throughout your life. If you start paying attention to the way the world works, you'll see this more and more and more. The story is that we've been telling ourselves as a society, as civilizations, is that there's this thing out there which is knowledge of the truth, and then there's power, which is a totally separate thing. What Foucault says is actually, no, those are the exact same thing, because whoever has power tells you what the knowledge is. And whoever has the knowledge, like if you can say, do things that other people can't, suddenly you will have power. Or usually more often it's a group that has power. So maybe a group of people who run a country, maybe a group of people who run the psychiatry association of their region or whatever, right? Or in this case, in popular culture, maybe it's Hollywood. Maybe it's the major corporations that own the major channels that we're all watching. Maybe it's Google, which owns YouTube and a number of other entities, right? Maybe that is where power resides. But then you could say, okay, so Google has all this power now. Let's get rid of Google, or let's get rid of whoever's making these decisions. And that's the other thing that Foucault says, right? This stuff can happen without any one person, like a king, making decisions. So Google sort of doesn't even exist anymore. I mean, you can still use Google, but it's actually a company called Alphabet, and it's been run by various different CEOs. And so it's stayed the same, but not because one person has been, like a puppet master, able to say what should and shouldn't happen. Instead, it's a bunch of little things that fit together and push us in a certain direction, right? So if you can search it online, then Google's probably interested in it. If you can't search it online, Google's probably, and I say Google, but I mean all of the people working, all of the devices connecting to it, all of that stuff, right? There's no one Google. It's a bunch of different stuff. It's a network. But anyway, the things that fit into Google and its search engine and everything are going to be emphasized, and the things that don't are going to be sort of discarded, or they're going to be brought into the loop so you can start searching that, right? That's how power and knowledge fit together. And I want you to just try to think about that in your own life, in your own experience. There are lots of things that you probably see on TV, and then there are, if you really start to think about it, things that you've never seen on TV, or very rarely seen on TV. And when I say TV, I mean streaming services and all that, of course. What are you allowed to say and what are you not allowed to say? And I don't mean swearing, or I don't mean certain phrases. I mean, there's ways of understanding the world that you're either allowed to express or you're not, and that's because of these power knowledge formations. So I've already said a lot. I'm sure that there are a bunch of questions. Ask me them. Ask me them by emailing, or ask me them on the Ask Me Anything page. I want you to just try to start unpacking these ideas, and as I said, they won't necessarily make a huge amount of sense to you immediately. I know it's early in the semester. This is probably maybe the first time you're reading Foucault, and so yeah, it's a difficult thing. But the more you start to ask yourself, okay, how is power and knowledge intertwined in this video I've watched, in this song that I'm listening to? I mean, who really gets to decide who is a popular singer? You would think that it's, well, the people like the best music, or the most popular person becomes popular because he or she is talented, and maybe, but there's also a lot of people who don't get that platform, right? And that relates to a lot of things that we'll talk about later in the class: money, influence, but always it comes down to sort of power and knowledge, and how not one person, but how groups of interactive people who, again, may disagree, end up kind of pushing things. And so think about that. Read Foucault, read him again. I mean, it's a short excerpt that I'm assigning, but it will help us kind of unpack all this stuff that's going on in popular culture. And I think one thing to walk away with is the idea that, for the most part, especially in this class, we're not looking for one person, usually, who's evil or who's amazing as the representative of power. Instead, we're looking at these things that are going on, these processes that may have no one in charge, and yet they're still happening. And we'll get into it later, but racism, for example, sexism, homophobia, all of these things. There's not necessarily one person at the top saying, I am going to make sure that everyone is racist or sexist, or that all Hollywood films are racist and sexist, or something like that. And yet, this can happen, right? Where you get a bunch of ideas flowing down from Hollywood or whatever, where you do see a lot of racism and sexism, even though maybe the director, the writer, the actors are not racist and sexist. How does that work? It works because of the ways that power and knowledge go in and out of these networks without necessarily having someone consciously choosing this to happen or not happen. That's power knowledge. Super difficult concept, but I promise you, the more you understand this, the more you'll understand the world around you, which I think is a good thing. Take care. See you next week.